Hello everyone, welcome to Civilspedia. As a part of today's Civilspedia, today we'll be looking at 4th September current affairs. In today's topic, we'll be looking at various topics like 2+2 talks between India and USA. Next, we'll look at public credit registry. And third, we'll look at UN Treaty on High Seas. And lastly, we will look at the instrument called as referendum, and we will do a critical analysis of this said instrument, referendum. Coming to the first topic, 2+2 talks. Now, these 2+2 talks is initiated between India and USA. Now, this 2+2 talks between India and USA is kind of modeled along the lines of 2+2 talks between India and Japan. Now, this 2+2 talks between India and USA is kind of modeled along the lines of 2+2 talks between India and Japan. Moving on to the next part, what is the main purpose of these 2+2 talks? Its main purpose is basically to increase strategic and defense cooperation between India and USA. So now if you look at a cooperation between India and USA, especially after this post-liberalization era, even though cooperation has been increasing year on year, this cooperation has been fairly confined towards economic cooperation. Comparatively, defense and strategic cooperation has been lagging behind. To basically increase this strategic and defense cooperation, these two countries have initiated 2+2 talks. Coming to the next part, what are the broader impacts of these 2+2 talks? There are three broader impacts. The first one is it's fairly obvious. By engaging in strategic and defense cooperation, we can gain critical information from US like terrorist information, and we can gain critical defense technologies from US because US is kind of the lone military superpower currently in the world. So we can gain all those critical information from US. The next thing is that by engaging in these strategic talks, we can kind of play a role in Afghanistan peace settlement process. We can kind of play a role in Asia Pacific region. We can play a role in all these regions. We can assert ourselves as regional and global superpower. And the third impact is that currently there's a kind of economic hardships going on between India and USA because USA is kind of imposing trade wars on India. So even though economic cooperation is kind of derailing, we can kind of shield our cooperation in strategic and defense sector. So we are basically diversifying our cooperation between India and USA. So that's it for first topic. We will move on to second topic now. So coming to a second topic, today we will be looking at public credit registry. In this topic, we will be looking at various aspects like first, what is PCR? And we look at why we need this public credit registry, and lastly we look at what are the broad advantages of creating public credit registry. So as I said in my last video, if a person like A wants to raise some money, he can raise money from three sources, and one such way is getting loans from a bank. So now if a person wants to make some capital investments, he can get loan from bank. Now coming from bank's perspective, if a bank wants to give a loan to a particular person, first, they have to know whether this person can be able to repay his loan back. For that reasons, bank will approach credit rating agency. Now, this job of credit rating agency is to assess credit worthiness of this particular individual A. That is, they will assess whether this person will repay those loans back. So, to assess his credit worthiness, they should have access to crucial credit information. That is his past credit history, like what are the loans he has taken, whether he has prepaid all those loans back. All those information should be accessible to credit rating agencies. For that purpose, public credit registry has been created. So, moving on to the next part, what is the necessity of creating this PCR and what are the advantages of creating PCR? Coming to the first part, what is the necessity of creating PCR? So in India, there is number of credit histories, but these credit histories are kind of scattered. There is separate credit history for loan taking. There is separate credit history for bond market. They're kind of separated in nature. To unify all these things, PCR should be created. So to unify all this credit history, PCR has to be created so as to make a better assessment of this said individual. So by creating this unifying public credit registry, there are three broad advantages. The first one is that it improves credit assessment of a particular individual. By improving assessment of a particular individual, individuals who are worthy enough to get that loans can get loans very easily. And the next advantage is that it improves credit information among consumers. It improves credit information among consumers. If consumers are coming to know that there is a kind of a separate registry which tracks all their credit information, consumers will be kind of motivated to repay all their loans back. And the next thing is that by creating this public credit registry, quality of lending quality of lending of loans will be improved, as a result of which ease of doing business will be improved in India. So moving on to the next part, what are the practices which are followed by other countries when it comes to public credit registry? In other countries, public credit registry includes other information like electricity bill and other utility bills. It includes number of utility bills as well. By including all this small information, we can make an accurate assessment of creditworthiness of a particular person. Coming to the last part, what is the impact on MSME sector? That is micro, small, medium enterprises. Now, if you look at the quantum of loans given by a particular bank, large chunk of those loans will go to large scale industries. Only small amount of loans will be given to small scale industries. The main reasons why banks are not giving loans to small scale industries is that banks are not able to assess their creditworthiness accurately. Now, by creating this public credit registry, their creditworthiness can be accurately assessed. So, as a result of which, loans to these sectors will be improved. As a result of which, employment can be generated, financial inclusion can be created. So, these are the broad advantages of creating public credit registry. So, that's it for the second topic. Now, we will move on to the third topic. So, now coming on to our next topic, we will be looking at the need for creation of United Nations Treaty on Protection of High Seas. In this topic, we will be looking at various aspects. The first thing we will be looking at is United Nations Law of Convention on Seas. Now, this is a major international law which kind of regulates high seas. Now, this particular law which covers only up to 200 nautical miles. That is up to exclusive economic zones. Now, beyond this point of exclusive economic zone, these waters are called as international waters. Now, there are no particular regulations put in place to regulate international waters, as a result of which navigation is free in these areas. That is, any ships can navigate through these waters. And the next important thing is that any company can fish in these areas. Since any company can fish in these areas, fishing has been going on indiscriminately in these high seas areas. So, moving on to the next part, what is the need for creation of this separate law for high seas? The first one, as I mentioned before, since there is no regulation put in place in these high seas areas, fishing has been going on indiscriminately. As a result of which, fish population is seen at subsequent decline. And the next thing is that almost 46% of Earth's area is coming under high seas area. So we have to put environmental laws in place to protect all these areas. So basically for these two reasons, we have to create a separate law for high seas. As a result of which, United Nations is currently moving out to put a separate regulations in place by around 2020. Currently, there are around 70 countries who are supporting this idea. So that's it for the third topic. We'll move on to the next topic. So coming to our last topic of today, we'll be looking at the device called as referendum. We'll do a critical analysis of this device, referendum. So a referendum is used in direct democracy. So if we talk about democracy, there are two broad types of democracy. The first one is direct democracy, and the next one is indirect democracy. So now in case of direct democracies, the decisions are mostly taken by the people themselves. Now in case of indirect democracies, people elect representatives, and representatives in turn take decisions on behalf of the people. So coming to the first part, direct democracy, as I mentioned earlier, in direct democracy, people take most of the decisions on their own. So there are three devices which people tend to use to take decisions on their own. Now these three devices are initiative, recall, and the last one is referendum. So now these are the three devices in which direct democracy uses to empower the people to take decisions on their own. So now moving on to the next slide, what exactly is referendum? Referendum is kind of an election device wherein a law can be either accepted or rejected by the people by means of popular vote. So by popular vote, it means elections. So by means of elections, a law can either be rejected or approved by the people. So that's what called as referendum. Now there are two broad types of referendum. The first one is legislative referendum. So in case of legislative referendum, the government itself calls for a referendum. That is, the law will be put forth by the government, and government will call for the referendum. Now in case of popular referendum, people themselves organize and call for a referendum on a particular law. So now you might be inclined to ask the question, popular referendum sounds a lot like initiative, but there is a difference between initiative and popular referendum, wherein in case of initiative, people themselves prepare a law and that law will be put into vote. Now in case of popular referendum, an already passed law will be put into vote. Now that's the difference between initiative and popular referendum. In case of initiative, people themselves prepare a law and that law will be put into vote. Now in case of popular referendum, already passed law will be put into vote. This is the difference between initiative and popular referendum. So now moving on, what are the recent referendums that has been taking place? Because recently there has been a huge spurt in usage of referendum device even in indirect democracies. So the first one is the mother of all recent referendums. The first one is Scottish referendum. So what this referendum is all about? It basically is about Scotland coming out of the Union of United Kingdom, because United Kingdom is an amalgamation of many nations like Britain, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and many other British territories. So it's an amalgamation of many Britain territories that is called as UK. Scottish independence referendum is about whether Scotland should come out of that union or not. The next one is a very famous one, Brexit referendum. It talks about whether UK should come out of EU or not. Now moving on to the next one, Turkish referendum. It basically talks about whether to expand the presidential powers of Turkish president, especially Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The next one is Colombian referendum, which is a very famous referendum, but not many people know about that. In Colombia, there is a 50-year civil war between FARC, Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and Colombian government. There was a 50-year civil war between FARC and Colombian government, and in 2016 these two warring parties negotiated a peace settlement, and that peace settlement was put into referendum. So that is Colombian referendum. And last one, it is a fairly recent one. It's Catalonian referendum. It's kind of similar to Scottish independence referendum, wherein the question was put whether Catalonia should come out of Spain or not. Now moving on to the next part, what are the advantages of usage of this referendum policy? So to know the advantages, first you have to know that after this 2008 financial crisis, inequality was on the rise. That is, the wealth between the richest person and the poorest person has been on the rise, and economic growth, generally speaking, economic growth has seen a subsequent decline. So as a result of which, many people are kind of angry with the government. So when many people are angry with the government, they tend to believe in the process of democracy less and less. So the first advantage of referendum is that it kind of re-engages these voters back into the process of democracy. So now if voters are kind of disenfranchised, many emotional parties like right-wing parties can use that emotion to fuel fascist tendencies. So to re-engage those voters back into the process of democracy, we can use this referendum. And the next one is that if there are two warring factions within a political party, to resolve that political dispute, we can call for a referendum. So for example, take the case of Brexit referendum. David Cameron from Tory party called for a referendum. In that Conservative party or called as Tory party, there were two warring factions. One faction called for Brexit, one faction did not call for Brexit. David Cameron came from that faction which argued for UK remaining in EU. Since there was two warring factions, to basically resolve their political dispute, he called for a referendum. And the next one is that if the government is trying to make any huge changes to the constitution, which was not part of their election campaign, they can call for a referendum. Because if that huge constitutional changes, if it was not a part of their campaign promise, many people will start asking questions and they can they can protest against the government. To avoid that, government can call for a referendum if they are making any huge constitutional changes. So now moving on to the next part, what are the broad disadvantages of calling in referendum? The first one is simplification of very complex and nuanced process into a simple yes or no vote. Now take the case of Brexit referendum itself. It's a very complicated process. Now Brexit referendum impacts will not be constrained towards economy alone. It involves large number of questions like, say for example, with the issue of immigration, what about EU nationals staying in Britain? What about Britain nationals staying in EU? And it complicates Northern Ireland border as well, because it was a part of Irish peace settlement process. It complicates a number of matters. So this complex matter is being put into a simple yes or no vote. So in this case, voters cannot critically judge whether to vote yes or no. And the next thing is that voter instead of not in voter cannot understand what they are being asked upon. Now take the case of Brexit referendum itself. The time when Brexit referendum was called and the time when the actual election took place, there was around 3 months time. Now this 3 months time is not enough for a voter to make a critical analysis. Now take for example, take the case of Jallikattu protest. Now it took around 3 or 4 years to properly organize people and to mobilize these people and to protest against the government. So this is kind of an organic process. Now in case of referendum, there is only 3 months time. In this 3 months time, voters cannot critically analyze the pros and cons of this said referendum. So when they cannot critically analyze the pros and cons of this said referendum, now political parties will appeal to their emotional quotient rather than to your rational quotient. So people will be swayed towards this emotional quotient and they tend to vote along these emotional arguments. So now the next one is that instead of when a referendum is called upon, instead of voters voting on that referendum, they can vote against the popularity of the government. So for example, take the case of Italian referendum, which was initiated in 2017. In that Italian referendum, it is also kind of similar to Turkish referendum. It called for expansion of presidential powers. So in that referendum, voters instead of voting for that referendum, voted against the popularity of Matteo Renzi's government. So in this case, voters instead of voting for that referendum will vote against the popularity of the government. And the last disadvantage is majority prevails in referendum. As is with number of elections, in a referendum always majority prevails, which is kind of detrimental to minority interests. Now take the case, for example, Babri Masjid issue. So if Babri Masjid issue is put into a referendum, majority of the Hindu population will vote for construction of abolition of Babri Masjid. But this referendum will be in the detrimental interest of minorities. So in referendum, majority always prevails, but the interest of minorities will be always sidelined. So that is a huge disadvantage of referendum. That's the disadvantage of in Colombian referendum process itself. In case of Colombian referendum process, as I said before, the peace settlement was put into vote. The peace settlement between FARC and Colombian government was put into vote. Now this peace settlement was rejected by the voters. If you look at the voters who rejected this peace settlement, these people largely came from plain people, that is people coming from cities and urban areas. But this peace settlement largely impacts hilly area people, which are minority in number. Since this peace settlement is kind of rejected, it is kind of detrimental to the interest of hilly people. So this is one of the very disadvantage of referendum process. So that's it for today. So if you have any doubts whatsoever, drop in the comments and I'll try to answer those questions. Thank you.